How's it going, folks? Today we are going to go into a little bit of a deep dive about selectors. I know we just covered selectors in class, and you're probably sick of them now, but we've covered a lot of topics that were really complicated, and so I want to go through them again just to make sure that people understand and have some resources to really understand how they work. So there are 5 kinds of selectors. There is the universal selector, which is the asterisk. Actually, let's go even further back than that. CSS blocks. They start with the selector, oops, and then open curly brace, close curly brace, and inside here we have our CSS style. So I'm just going to use background color as an example. So what this selector can be, this is the piece we're going to be talking about today. So if I do an asterisk, this is the universal selector. What that means is it applies directly to any single element. So if I save this here and reload this page, you can see it's on the body. So if I look at the HTML has it, the head tag has it, even though the head won't do anything, the body has it. If I put a div in here, empty div, that div also has it as well. So the universal selector applies to everything, every single element on the page, even if it doesn't make any sense for that style to be applied. And the browser's pretty good about that. For example, you see in the head tag here, or the head element, we had this universal selector. The browser's just going to ignore it. It knows that doesn't make any sense. So universal selector. The least specific selector is the universal selector. Everything overrides it. So if I have another selector, tag selector, on a div, let's say. Now, this is a tag selector. This uses the tag name of an element. So this can be a div, this can be a paragraph, this can be anything. Color blue. If I change that to blue, you can see now my div in here still has that universal selector because that's on everything. But now it's got another selector that overrides that because a tag selector is more specific than the universal selector. So these are the first 2 kinds of selectors: universal, tag. What's the next one? Class. And so if I make another div here and I set its class to be special, oops, div 2. If I run this right now, you can see it takes on, it's not Danish, it takes on that same background color from the div because it is a div. A class selector starts with a dot. And the reason it starts with a dot is because it's possible in HTML and JavaScript to make unique tags. So the browser needs to know that this isn't a tag. So if I just say special, like that, it's going to think that this is a tag. There's a tag called special, when in fact I want it to be a class. So I have to tell it that with a dot, and that's the only way the browser knows that. Make that a yellow. And you can see now, this is now yellow because the class selector overrides the tag selector and the universal selector. It's more specific than either of these two. The next specific is going to be the ID selector. So if I copy this again, I make this div 3. Note that you can apply a class, remember, to multiple divs. So if I run this, now I have div 3. I really don't know why it thinks it's Danish. Maybe div is Danish. Just change it to section. Let's try that. Today, in this deep dive, we'll learn Danish. No, it still thinks it's Danish. What on this page? Okay, page is not Danish. No, it's not any language. So, section 3. Same class, same background color, but we're going to put an ID on this. I'm going to call it section 3. IDs, you generally want to be pretty specific with them because you can only have one of them, whereas classes, you want to be a little more generic. Similar to the class, if I just said section 3 here, the browser doesn't know that this isn't a tag. So I have to put a hash in front of it. Now the hash tells the browser this is an ID. You're looking for an ID called section 3. Let's make a background color of purple. And now you can see in here that ID overrides all of the above. So we've got our body tag, which has the universal, this div, which has the tag selector, which overrides that. Class selector overrides tag selector. ID selector overrides class selector. These are the 4 different types of selectors, the standard selectors. You're probably not going to run into this much, this particular one. All right. Now, let's take a look at compound selectors. Now, there's 2 kinds of compound selectors. The first one is where I have something that is like a tag and a class. So div special, for instance. And this is more specific than either this or this. This is not a tag selector and it is not a class selector. It has to match both. So it's actually more specific than either one. So if I have something that's a div and a special and I put it in here, I mean, it's only going to match these 2 right now. But let's actually just change the color on this to I like green. Green's good. You can see it matches this. It's a little hard to see. That purple maybe isn't the best. Let's see if I make that teal instead. Whoa, okay, never mind. Purple it is. So, but you can kind of see section 2 and section 3 have used this selector because it matches both of them. But if I made a paragraph, oops, special paragraph, you can see it gets that yellow from the class. But it doesn't get this text color because it had to be a class that matches this div specifically. And you can do this with other things as well. So you can say div section 3 like that, which is specifically an ID. This maybe is not as useful because you're only using the ID in one place, but you can do it. You could also, if you wanted to have something that had multiple classes, special and special 2, more special, oops. If we look at this right now, it's got that yellow, but maybe we want this one specifically to also change the text color, but not this paragraph. I feel like I'm spelling special wrong. If you use a word long enough, it just starts to look like not a word. So if I put a dot and then another dot, another class after it, then whatever the selector is must match both. So if I make that white. Okay, so you can see, that's a little hard to see, but yeah, yellow and white, not a great color combo. This color only matches this thing here because it's got this class and this class. It has to match both classes. And so you can keep going. You can have 3 classes. You can have a paragraph and special 2, for instance. You're only going to have 1 tag because an element can't have more than 1 tag, but an element can have more than 1 class. So you can always do this with classes. The next version of a compound selector, I'm going to get rid of some of these and clean this up a little bit, is having multiple selectors to go into children. So if I have this div and inside here I have a header, and then inside this header I have a paragraph that has a class of I'm just going to say Charles because that sprang into my head for some reason. So now we've got our header, we've got these, but these are nested in here. So if we put something on the div and set them to red, they're both going to be red because that cascades down. If we have another paragraph out here that also has that class, and I'm going to just say Bob, you know, it's not going to be red. If we say we want to use Charles, well, then these two are going to be red. But maybe we just want this one. Maybe we just want the paragraph Charles specifically inside the div to have this red color. So in that case, we write our selector, we say div space and then the class. And what this says is find me all divs on the page, and then inside those, find any element that has this class in their child tree. And so if we do that, that's here. Now note, this could be nested a couple times. So if I nest this in here, it's a div inside a div. So this paragraph is now a grandchild of this div, actually. I'm going to make this a span, just to make it clear that it's the grandchild of the div. And you see it still works. It still works because that Charles, it doesn't really care where it is in that tree. We could make it more specific too. So like any of those other compound selectors that we went over can go here. You could do another one if maybe inside here we've got another span, and that's maybe the person's name is Charles Browning, but we want to change that span. So that's the only thing that's red. So we can put that in here, and now it's just this. And so you'll see this specifically will look for any span that is in this class that is in a div, which this is the only thing that matches. So you can make some very specific selectors here. This also increases specificity. So if you have something that is like this, oops, and change it to blue, you can see it stays red because this was defined afterwards and still is using that class and the tag, so it's the same level as this, but this is more specific. The more detail you give a selector, so it'd be the same thing if I said here, so if I did this, it would be blue, but if I change this to clarify that's a paragraph, then it goes back to red, because this is a more specific selector. So this can be useful if you've got text or something on a screen that you're trying to change, but like you don't control the code that creates it. You can always make a more specific selector and use that to control it. On the other hand, this is a little bit more fragile because if all of a sudden this becomes not a paragraph anymore, if I decide I want to change it to a section, then that CSS rule no longer applies because this is looking specifically for a paragraph. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there, where the more specific your selector becomes, the more likely it's going to not be overridden, but the more fragile it is as well. All right, so let's talk about attribute selectors. We went over this a little bit in class, but it's kind of complicated, so let's go a little bit more of a deep dive into it. Let's say I have a div and I have content on it, and then I have another div and I have some more content. Okay, we see that here. This particular div, I want this div to become green, but I don't want to put an ID on it. I don't want to put a class on it for some reason. So instead what I can do is I can say, I can put an attribute. I can say data color, data green equals yes. And what I can do now, if I just put a selector like this, it would do both divs. But what I can do here is I can use brackets and put the name of the attribute. And what this does, you see this attribute matches this attribute. And this can be any attribute. So if I put something like this in here, I can put this in here, like that. And what that does is it says this only matches divs that have that attribute. So now you can see it only matches this bottom one. And it doesn't matter the yes. I can just change this to complete gibberish. The browser doesn't care about that. What it cares about specifically is that does this attribute exist? Then this will match. This is also, again, so if I color blue, this also makes it more specific. So you can see in here, this is overriding this because it's got the more specific attribute on it. Now, there's a couple of other fun things we can do here. I can say specifically that this has to equal yes. So if this equals no, then it wouldn't be on there. But if I make another one down here, content, and I change it to yes, it will be green. And so it's looking specifically for the value in this attribute. Now, this can be kind of useful if we're starting to build out complicated UIs, we can actually move a lot of our logic into the selectors this way. And then this means that there's less work that our JavaScript code is doing. You probably don't care about too much right now, because if you want something to be green, you just put an ID on it, right? But if there's 10,000 of these, then you don't have a green, and sometimes it's a little bit less efficient to use a class. But this is just an important thing to know that you have the ability to use. So, let's say if we did this. Yes, please. Well, that doesn't match anymore. It's not yes. It's yes, please. And in the browser, it sees this string, and they have to be equal every single character. So that brings us to what we covered in class yesterday, $sign and asterisk. So if you put an asterisk here, it will start matching again. Why? Because the asterisk says, I don't want you to just check these strings to make sure they're equal. I want you to see is yes contained anywhere in here. So if I get rid of this, so it's more of a little old English, doesn't match. But if I say yes, it does. And again, there could be complete gibberish in this. Oops. As long as that word yes is still contained in there, it'll match. The other thing is maybe I want to make sure, and I want to say, okay, this only works if you're polite. So I say, please. That will work too. But I want to say, well, I want to make sure that they're not saying like, please don't do it. So I want to make sure that it says, it just says please at the very end. I know this is the analogy here is starting to fall apart. Just stick with me. So if I want to make sure this please is at the end, so that's specifically a yes please, I need to change this to a $sign. And what the $sign does is it says make sure that the attribute ends in this. So you can see this ends here. If I put a bunch of stuff in here, it no longer matches, even though it's contained. So a little complicated, but basically, let's just do it like this. The asterisk is for if the value of the attribute contains this string anywhere, like in this third one. The $sign is where it contains it only at the end. All right, and so that's you're probably not going to run into this too often. Once we get to JavaScript as well, there's other ways in JavaScript to do this sort of thing, but this just makes it a little easier and gives you some more ability for that. All right, so let's look at child and sibling selectors. So we had that previous example, span data, and then let's say we had another span more data here. And then I had a span out here. Outside data. This is not Italian. Oh my goodness. So let's say we wanted to just modify this one, but not this one. If we say div span, color red, well, you see it doesn't both because they're both in the child tree of div. That's a little problematic, right? We don't necessarily want this one. So what we can do is we can use the greater than sign. And the greater than sign says only immediate children. Oops, wow, that's not what I wanted. Only immediate children. should go there. So this span is a grandchild of div. This one is the child, so that's the only one that gets applied to when you use this little greater than sign. The other one, let's do a section div, just to use another. Let's see, how do I want to do this? Div data. I'm just gonna call this a div, whatever. And then I'm gonna replicate this thing here. So let's talk about siblings. So let's say we've got this structure, and we've got a class on this. This is getting a little complicated. So let's get rid of this one and this one. So basically at this point now, we've got two sections. I'm just gonna get rid of this div too. Inside our div, or inside our body. And one of them has a div and a span. The other one has a div and a span, but the div has a class on it. And specifically, we want to give this span a special color. So if we said section span, well, that'll get them both. We don't want this one. So what we can do, if we say section, and then we said div special, well, that's not going to do anything at all because this is a section, then the div, then a span inside that div. But this span's not inside that div. It's a sibling of it. So what we can do is the plus. And what that plus, and you can see now this shows up, what that plus does is it says, okay, find me this section, find me this particular div, which is right here, then get me a span that is a sibling of it, that is at the same level in the tree. And if we look here, we can see this span is at the same level in the tree as that particular div. And so that's what the sibling selector is. And what that's useful for is if you want one of your siblings to do something special when an element does something. One common example is like if you have a checkbox. Oops. Check. And then we've got a label next to it. And maybe we've got something in here, check me. And then we do something like this. Well, what does this look like? Okay, so we've got this. Oh, wow, okay. I think it is checkbox. Yep. So it's like, check me, thank you, but we don't want the thank you to show up until you've checked it. So let's add a class on this. Check. I'll just call this thanks. That's a better name. So we'll start this out hidden. Okay, that's great. That shows up. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say, okay, input checkbox. And so what I've done here is I've used specifically an attribute selector. I've said I want inputs only where the attribute type equals checkbox. But also, and this is a pseudo class, if it's checked. So this will only activate if I check this. Then I'm going to say plus, give me a sibling selector of a span with a class thanks. And at that point, I want it to display. So if we check this now, oh, it didn't show up. Time to debug, because that definitely should have worked. Thanks, display none, type checkbox. As soon as this is checked, let's make this a little simpler. Because that should have worked. Let's make color red. Okay, so that works. Maybe it doesn't like the display. Let's take this off real quick. Okay, so it is. Oh, interesting. Okay, so this is just the. Let's try that. Okay, so what we learned something valuable today. This plus cannot affect this because it's not a direct sibling. So if we put this here, This is not going to look super great, but now it affects it. So I think what we want now. Nope, that's still not working. Oh, color. There we go. So maybe not the best thing in the world, right? But that's an interesting thing. This plus can't affect a sibling that's not an immediate sibling. So the sibling has to be right next to it, probably above or below it. So if I put this here and made this red instead. Oh no, it only affects the one. Okay. So yeah, it only affects the one after it. Now I've learned, now you've learned. This is why you want to experiment with this stuff, because up until about 3 minutes ago, I thought that this would affect any sibling that was anywhere in that section, but it looks like it only affects the one immediately after, which is really useful to know because you're not gonna rely on it otherwise. So yeah, also that should serve as a reminder to you that even the most experienced of us still make mistakes. It's definitely not something to be ashamed of. It's never a problem. Just make sure that you pick up as long as you can kind of experiment around like you saw I did there. Tried to kind of figure out what is this doing? Is it doing anything? When does it do something? And what I've eventually figured out, right, is that it has to be the one right after it because if I put it before, it doesn't affect it. If I put it two before, it doesn't affect it, but right after it does. So that teaches us something new about CSS. I would definitely recommend playing around with this yourselves. If you see something, check it out. Run up a little example like this. Like you can see, this is a completely useless example, but it taught us something valuable. So your examples don't have to be projects that are like you're going to finish them and put them up in GitHub. You can just throw up some stuff and see how it works. Anyway, I hope this was valuable. If y'all have any questions or comments on this, be sure to let me know.